I thought I escaped when I left that house, when I slammed the door and swore I'd never go back. But last week, I heard my father's voice on the phone, and he knew exactly where I was.
Welcome to Reddit Toxic Family Telltales channel. New episode every day.
Parents of kids in lockup. What's the worst call you've ever gotten? Mine came out of nowhere. My phone rang, and the voice on the other end said my son was in the hospital. His skull had been fractured by his cellmate. They claimed it was some kind of gang fight that spiraled out of control. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white as I sped to the hospital. And when I got there, the sight that met me nearly broke me. My boy was lying in a bed, hooked up to machines, blood pooling inside his brain. A nurse whispered, "Prepare yourself for the worst." I sat in that waiting room with two thoughts pounding in my head. Would my son survive? And why were they lying? Neither he nor his cellmate had anything to do with gangs. When the doctor finally came out and told me my son was alive, I could have collapsed from relief. For 1 second, I felt like the luckiest father in the world. But that joy shattered when the doctor pulled me aside and said the bleeding had damaged the part of his brain that controls speech. My son couldn't talk anymore. He couldn't tell me he loved me. He couldn't tell me what really happened in that cell. And then, the doctor's voice got even quieter. The injuries weren't just on his head. There was old trauma inside his body. Trauma that had nothing to do with any so-called fight. The next morning, I marched into that detention center. Officer Bryant, the one who'd called me, was sitting at the front desk. "How's Caleb?" He asked like nothing was wrong. "He can't speak anymore." I shot back. "Jason really did that much damage?" Bryant didn't even flinch. "Fights get brutal in here." But I knew right then he was lying. Because Jason's mom had already shown me the paperwork. Her son had been in the lockdown unit since Sunday. He couldn't have been in my boy's cell. When I threw that in Bryant's face, his whole expression shifted. He jumped up so fast papers went flying off his desk. "She must be mistaken." That's when Jason's mother walked in, right on cue, and signed the visitor log in a loud, clear voice. "Here to see Jason Mitchell in Lockdown Unit B." Bryant's face went pale as snow. He'd been caught red-handed. And suddenly, I was dismissed, pushed out the door like trash. But that night, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. A woman's voice, barely above a whisper. "I heard about your boy. I work there. Tuesday nights, certain boys don't go to bed. They get taken to the counseling room. Your son was one of them." My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the phone. Caleb's injuries had happened on a Tuesday night. The next day, I stormed into the warden's office. "My son was hurt on a Tuesday. I'm told he gets taken to counseling on Tuesdays. What's happening in that room?" Warden Sparks pulled out a folder, calm as ice. "Your son's intake forms show pre-existing conditions." I yanked the paper from his hand. The ink was so fresh it might have still been drying. And the signature? It wasn't mine. They were forging documents. "You're covering up sexual assault." I spat. His eyes narrowed. "That's a dangerous accusation. Be careful, Mr. Williams. Defamation of correctional staff is a crime." Walking out to the parking lot, I felt like I was losing my mind. But then a woman approached me. "They got your boy too." She pulled out her phone, showing me file after file. "My nephew Timothy, same brain injury 3 months ago. My sister's boy Dante, 6 months ago. I've tracked it. 17 boys in 2 years. All Tuesday nights. All lost their ability to speak. It's deliberate. They're silencing witnesses." I felt sick. Then she showed me one last message. Something Timothy had saved before he died. A boy inside had written, "Asterisk, there are hidden cameras in the counseling room. The warden keeps the recordings. Asterisk. We needed the police. But when I went to the station and dropped the names, the desk sergeant cut me off. Henderson, Cole, Internal Affairs. All connected. Filing false reports against law enforcement is a felony. Stop now, or you'll end up in a cell next to your son." That's when I knew. Nobody was coming to help us. They were protecting each other. So that night I called my brother Deshaun and my cousin James. Both had done time. Both knew how these places worked. "They're targeting kids, destroying their speech centers so they can't testify," I told them. "My boy's cousin works maintenance in there," Deshaun said. "Tuesday night, Bryant works alone." 3 nights later, we slipped in through the service door at 11 p.m. My heart was hammering so loud I was sure someone would hear it. And through the window of that counseling room, I saw him, Officer Bryant, standing behind a kid who couldn't have been more than 14, bent over the table. That was it. Deshaun kicked the door in. Bryant spun around, pants still half undone. The boy collapsed, sobbing. James scooped him up, wrapped him in his jacket, carried him out like he was his own son. Bryant lunged for his radio, but Deshaun smacked it away and shoved a phone in his face. "Start talking," he growled, recording everything. I'll never forget it. The blood streaming from Bryant's nose, the tears, the way he stammered when Deshaun asked about Caleb, about the other boys. "It's not just us," Bryant sobbed. "The warden sells the videos, hidden cameras. The judge buys them. Senator Davies. 50 grand a tape." My stomach turned. "You destroyed their speech centers on purpose?" The warden said, "If they can't talk, they can't testify." Henderson knew where to hit. targeted trauma to the brain. And the recordings? In the warden's office. Safe behind the family picture. Combination 0-7-1-5. Deshaun bolted. 20 minutes later, he came back holding a hard drive. His hands were trembling. Hundreds of videos. Every single one of them. I knelt down next to Bryant. My fists still ached, but I didn't care. I leaned in close, grabbed him by the collar, and whispered, "Are you ready?" The man broke down right there on the floor. Blood was running down his face, mixing with the snot and tears pouring out of him. His whole body shook as he looked up at me, desperate, like a cornered animal. What he was feeling in that moment was nothing compared to what our boys had been forced to endure. Deshaun kept the phone steady, capturing every second, while James stood guard at the door, eyes sharp on the hallway. I pressed harder. Who else? Who else besides the names you already gave us? Bryant's sobs turned to gasps. Finally, he choked out, "The Harden brothers. Officer Aaron Harden, Officer Caden Harden. They worked different shifts to cover more nights." My stomach twisted. 2 more predators protected by their uniforms. He said the warden decided who got sent to that so-called counseling room. They targeted kids who wouldn't be missed, boys without strong families, without lawyers, kids from homes like mine. And then I asked the one question that burned inside me. Why Caleb? Bryant sniffled, wiped his nose with the back of his hand, and answered, "They go through intake forms. Look for single parents, low-income addresses, no lawyer listed. Families who can't fight back." My hands trembled with rage. They'd put my son on a list because they thought we were powerless. Behind me, the rescued boy sat curled in the corner, still wrapped in James's jacket. His small body shook like a leaf in the wind. I went over, dropped to my knees, and softened my voice. "You're safe now. Nobody's ever going to hurt you again." He just nodded, too terrified to speak. That silence told me everything. Then Deshaun called me over, showing me what he'd pulled up on the hard drive through his phone. Hundreds of video files neatly organized by date. And next to each file, price tag, buyer initials, exactly the way Bryant had described. SD, Senator Davies, 50,000. JH, a judge, 30,000 each. My stomach turned as the reality sank in. These weren't just crimes. These kids were being sold like products. And then I saw it. The timestamp, the file from the Tuesday night my son was hurt. It was right there, sitting on that drive. My finger hovered over the screen, but I couldn't open it. Not yet. Not that one. We didn't have time to waste. Someone would notice Bryant missing from his post, and if they caught us here, it would all be over. We tied him up fast. Deshaun grabbed some extension cords. James found duct tape. We bound Bryant's wrists and ankles tight, slapped tape over his mouth. He tried to mumble something, but I didn't want to hear another word. He stayed there on the counseling room floor, the same room where he'd destroyed so many lives. James lifted the boy gently in his arms like he weighed nothing. The kid wrapped his arms around James's neck and buried his face in his shoulder, clinging to him like it was the only safe place left in the world. We moved quickly. Deshaun tucked the hard drive under his arm, kept his phone rolling, while I checked the hall one last time. Clear. We slipped through the service door, out into the cold night air, and into the parking lot. The silence out there was almost unbearable, just the echo of our footsteps on the concrete. We got to the car, slid the boy into the back seat, James sitting beside him while Deshaun climbed up front with me. I started the engine and forced myself to drive calm, steady, even though my pulse was slamming in my ears. We headed to Deshaun's girlfriend's house, Josephine. 20 minutes away. She was a registered foster parent, someone who had taken in kids before, kids who had nowhere else to go. The boy didn't say a word during the ride, just sat there in James's jacket, staring at nothing. Broken. When we pulled up, Josephine was already standing at the door. She rushed out the second we parked, took one look at the boy, and her whole face shifted into caretaker mode. She wrapped him in her arms, brought him inside, sat him gently on the couch. She got him water, a blanket, spoke to him in that calm, steady voice only true caregivers know how to use. That's when it happened. For the first time, the boy spoke. His voice was so faint we almost missed it. "My name is Ryder," he whispered. "Ryder Melton, 14. Been here 3 months." And then his story poured out. Shoplifting food. That's why he was locked up. He was hungry. He'd been dragged into that counseling room 4 times already. The first time just 2 weeks after arriving. They told him it was a simple evaluation. But when Bryant locked that door, Ryder knew something was wrong. Each time after that got worse. They threatened him, told him if he said a word, the punishment would be worse than anything he could imagine. And he wasn't the only one. Other boys in his unit knew. Some of them had been through it too. Josephine didn't flinch. She grabbed her camera, explained gently what she was doing, and began documenting his injuries. Bruises on his arms, marks on his wrists where restraints had cut into his skin. She took photos of everything, her hands steady, creating a record they couldn't deny. This time there would be proof. Josephine sat down across from us, her voice low but steady. She told us she'd seen boys come through her doors for years with the same injuries, the same hollow looks. She'd treated the bruises, the broken spirits, the silence, but she'd never known why. Some of those kids couldn't talk anymore, their speech just gone. Others were too terrified to open their mouths. And now, for the first time, she finally understood. The system hadn't just failed them. It had fed them to the monsters running that place. Ryder started crying again, soft, broken sobs. Josephine wrapped her arms around him, rocked him gently while he shook. Deshaun was already working like a man possessed. 3 laptops open, cords everywhere. He had the hard drive plugged in, making copies on a pile of USB sticks he'd pulled out of his backpack. James kept his eyes on the window, scanning the street like a hawk in case anyone had followed us. I sat there, numb, my mind spinning back to Caleb, my boy, lying in a hospital bed, machines beeping around him, lips parted but no words coming out. And now I knew. Now I had the truth. Proof carved in files and video. But it didn't heal the rage boiling inside me. I pulled out my phone and found the number Timothy's and had pressed into my hand that night in the parking lot. My thumb hovered over the screen before I hit call. She answered on the 3rd ring. I could barely get the words out. We've got it all. The videos. Bryant's confession. Everything. The sound of her breaking down on the other end nearly floored me. She kept whispering, "Thank you. Thank you. I've been waiting 2 years for someone to believe me about Timothy." While I held the phone to my ear, Deshaun didn't stop moving. He was making copy after copy. 3 laptops working at once. Files flooding into USB drives. James had gone out to buy more. Deshaun even started uploading encrypted backups to the cloud using burner emails he'd just created. He wasn't taking chances. If something happened to us, the evidence would survive. Josephine came over quietly. She said she'd already reached out to a trauma counselor she trusted. Someone who specialized in children who had been through the unthinkable. Ryder would be seen first thing in the morning. Until then, Josephine promised he'd be safe under her roof. The kid had curled up on the couch, still wrapped in James's jacket like it was a shield. Every few minutes he'd jolt awake, eyes wide, scanning the room like he expected someone to drag him back. And then, he'd remember where he was. When the copying was done, Deshaun handed me 5 USB drives. I shoved them into separate pockets, making sure no 2 were together. James got 3 more to stash at his place. We spread the evidence like seeds, too many to kill at once. We agreed to meet in the morning, but that night, there was no sleep for me. I lay staring at the ceiling, every second seeing my son hooked up to machines, nurses moving in and out while he fought to stay alive. And all the while, the men who'd destroyed him still walked free. I couldn't stop replaying the image of Bryant on that floor, the way his pants had been undone, the boy bent over that table, and the thought that it could have been Caleb in that same spot. Tuesday after Tuesday, while I sat at home, believing my son was safe in detention, I got up and paced the apartment, looking down at the empty street outside my window. The evidence was real, but the system? Corrupt, rotten to the core. Judges, senators, cops, they weren't going to stop this. They were buying it. If we waited for justice the normal way, more kids would get hurt. Witnesses silenced. Files destroyed. I knew we had to move faster than the machine built to protect predators. The next morning, my phone lit up with notifications. News alerts. Every local outlet running the same headline. Officer Bryant found bound at detention center. Warden claims gang-related break-in. I watched the footage with my hands clenched. Bryant's employee photo flashed across the screen, and the anchor's voice said he was recovering at home after a traumatic attack. Gang retaliation. That was their story, and the world was buying it. My phone buzzed again. An unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. A woman's voice came through, shaky but determined. She said she was Bryant's wife, and her husband wanted to make a deal. He'd testify against everyone involved if we agreed not to press charges for what he'd done to the boys. I repeated it out loud, and Deshaun, sitting next to me, immediately shook his head. Trap, he mouthed, eyes narrowed. And he was right, it sounded exactly like the kind of setup they'd try to pull. But we needed testimony. We needed Bryant's word to tie everything together. Without that, the system would bury us. So I agreed to meet. I chose a public diner downtown, figuring the crowd would give me at least some protection. An hour later, I walked in and spotted her instantly. A woman hunched in the corner booth, her coffee cup trembling in her hands. Her eyes were swollen, rimmed red like she hadn't slept in days. She looked up as I slid into the booth, and the words came spilling out. She said she had no idea what her husband had been doing until last night, when he came home bloody and broke down, confessing everything. Then she pulled out her phone and slid it across the table. My stomach dropped as I read message after message between Bryant and the other guards. Texts detailing their Tuesday night sessions, who they'd take, what they'd do, jokes about silencing kids, and dates stretching back months. It was like looking straight into hell. Her hands shook as she whispered that Bryant had admitted it all to her. The warden selling the videos, the deliberate brain injuries, the judge and senator paying tens of thousands per recording. I leaned in close and told her flatly, if Bryant wants any shot at a lighter sentence, he needs to turn himself in and fully cooperate. That's the only way. She nodded, said she'd already told him the same. But then her grip tightened on my arm. Her voice dropped to a warning. The warden has people everywhere. You're in danger now. All of you are. Her fear was real. I could see it in her eyes. When I left the diner, I checked my mirrors every few seconds. Every car behind me felt like it could be following. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, my gut twisted, because 2 squad cars were already there, lights flashing against the walls. 4 officers stepped out, one holding a folded stack of papers. "We have a warrant for your arrest. Assault and battery on Officer Bryant. Retaliation." They weren't even trying to hide it. Could have run. God knows I wanted to, but running would have made me look guilty of more than I'd already been accused of. So I froze. Then Deshaun suddenly appeared, jumping out of his car across the street, phone in hand. "This is live," he shouted. "Facebook and YouTube. Everyone's watching." The officers faltered for just a second at the word live. But the lead officer pushed through, grabbing my arm and twisting it behind me so hard my shoulder nearly popped. Cold cuffs snapped shut around my wrists way too tight, cutting into my skin. He started rattling off my rights, but I barely heard him over the sound of neighbors gathering, whispering, pulling out their own phones. Deshaun kept his camera steady, his voice loud and clear. "They're arresting him for exposing child abuse at the detention center." The crowd gasped, some shouting back at the cops. It didn't matter. They shoved me toward the cruiser, slamming my head against the doorframe on the way in. Pain flared across my skull. Through the rear window, I could see Deshaun following us in his car. His phone still pointed at my arrest. He wasn't letting them bury this quietly. At the station, they stripped me of everything. Phone, wallet, even my belt. Fingerprints, mugshot, cold metal chair, and then a holding cell that reeked of piss and vomit, the stench making my stomach turn. 2 hours ticked by. Then the door opened. Deputy Chief Henderson himself stepped in, chest full of medals and ribbons, his face carved from stone. He pulled out a chair, sat across from me, and folded his hands. "You're in serious trouble," he said slowly, deliberately, "for attacking my brother's colleague." I stared him dead in the eye. "I want a lawyer," and I didn't say another word. Henderson leaned forward, his voice low and cold. "Lawyers won't save you," he sneered. "You broke into a government facility. You assaulted staff. That's 20 years easy. 20 years behind bars while your son grows up without a father." I kept my eyes locked on the wall behind him, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Silence was my only weapon. He slammed his palm down on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "You're digging yourself deeper by not cooperating." And that's when the door opened. A young woman walked in, carrying a leather briefcase. She introduced herself firmly. "Haley Robbins. I'm his court-appointed attorney." Her tone was like steel. "This interview is over. I need to speak with my client privately." Henderson's jaw tightened, his face burning red. He glared at me one last time and growled, "This isn't over." Then he stormed out, the door banging shut behind him. Haley waited until the echo died, then leaned in close. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I've been waiting years for this. Years for someone to finally expose what's happening in that place." My chest tightened. Could I actually trust her? She opened her legal pad and explained she'd been quietly collecting complaints from families, building a file, but she'd never had proof. Not until now. Within an hour, she had me released on bail using a technicality about the arrest being improperly handled. Just like that, I was free. Outside the station, she asked to see what evidence we had. I didn't take her to my apartment. Too risky. Instead, we drove to Deshaun's place, where one of the USB drives was hidden. I plugged it into his laptop, but I didn't let it out of my sight. Not until I knew I could trust her. Haley leaned forward, eyes fixed on the screen. 30 seconds into one of the videos, she slapped her hand over her mouth and bolted for the bathroom. I could hear her retching. When she came back, her face was pale as paper. "This is enough," she whispered. "Enough to bring down every single one of them." Right there, she started making calls. Within the hour, she'd arranged a meeting with an FBI agent named Donald Wyatt, a man already investigating Senator Davies for campaign finance crimes. Haley said this could be the missing link he needed. The next morning, we sat in a secure room at a federal building downtown while Agent Wyatt reviewed everything. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the files, as he listened to Bryant's recorded confession. Then he snapped the folder shut. "This is federal now. Local law enforcement has no jurisdiction. They can't touch you." He assigned agents to protect me, Deshaun, James, and Ryder. That night, the FBI raided the detention center with a federal warrant. The news footage was surreal. Agents hauling box after box out of the facility, parents of detained kids sobbing behind police tape. And then the headline I'll never forget. "Warden Sparks arrested at home, 3 a.m. They found more videos in his personal safe. More financial records tying everything together. And the next day, Bryant turned himself in. His wife had convinced him it was his only chance at seeing the outside of a prison again. Agent Wyatt wired him up, sent him back to meet with the guards. Bryant's hands were shaking so badly during the meeting that Officer Henderson narrowed his eyes. "What's wrong with you? You sick?" Bryant stammered. "Just worried about the raid. Think we should be concerned." That was all it took. Henderson and Cole started talking fast. About destroying evidence. About moving money. About warning the Harden brothers. And then, they said the words on tape. Admitting they'd been doing this for years. Admitting the warden paid them extra to keep quiet. every syllable captured. And this time, there was no covering it up. Within hours, it all came crashing down. The FBI moved fast. Cole, Henderson, the Hardin brothers, all yanked from their homes in the middle of the night. The Hardin brothers thought they could bolt, but agents tackled them flat in their own backyard. At the station, the whole crew collapsed under pressure. They turned on each other instantly, clawing for deals like rats scrambling off a sinking ship. Cole swore it was Henderson's idea to target the boys' speech centers, damage them just enough so they could never testify. Henderson blamed the warden, saying Sparks was the one pocketing most of the video money. And the Hardin brothers? They claimed they were forced to participate, that it was either obey or lose their jobs. Agent Wyatt didn't sugarcoat it. They're all facing federal charges. Mandatory minimum of 25 years. No way out. The next morning, Wyatt called me into his office. His desk was covered in bank records, neat stacks of paper that made my stomach twist. He showed me transfers traced straight to the judge. 6 years' worth, funneled into Cayman Islands accounts. Over $2 million. And Senator Davies? Worse. Almost $4 million through shell companies his accountant had set up. Wyatt slid me a spreadsheet, every date matched to a victim, every transaction tied to an assault. And then I saw it. Caleb's name. $50,000 beside it. I sat down hard, like the air had been knocked out of me. My son. They had put a price tag on my son. 3 days later, Ryder had to testify before the grand jury. Josephine held his hand the whole way to the federal courthouse, never letting go. I waited outside, pacing, while he spent 2 hours reliving the nightmare. When he came out, he was pale and shaking, but the prosecutor said he'd been incredible, gave them everything they needed. That afternoon, the news broke, the arrests, the charges, and then my phone exploded with calls. Parents I'd never met, fathers, mothers, sobbing into the receiver. Their sons wanted to talk now. Over the next week, 17 boys came forward. 17. Every single one with the same deliberate injury pattern in their speech centers. The FBI searched Sparks' house again, this time with better tech. And that's when they uncovered it. A hidden room behind a bookshelf in his basement. A full studio. $500,000 in equipment. Editing computers. Soundproof walls. And backup drives. Every video cataloged by date and victim. 8 years worth. Meanwhile, I visited Caleb every morning. Sat by his bed, held his hand, and told him we got them. We got the bad men. He couldn't answer, but his eyes followed me, locked on my face. And the day I told him Bryant was going away forever, his fingers tightened around mine harder than they had since the injury. The nurse said it was a good sign. His brain was fighting to heal. Haley came to the hospital with stacks of legal documents for the civil suit. She explained that damages could reach $100 million, enough for lifetime care for every victim, and then some. And just when I thought it couldn't get any bigger, the judge tried to flee. His lawyer must have warned him the indictments were coming. Airport security grabbed him at the international terminal. Fake passport in one hand, 30 grand in cash in the other. The footage was everywhere. Him crying, begging, claiming innocence, while agents dragged him away in cuffs. Finally, the whole city could see the truth. The next morning, Senator Davies stepped up to a podium with the flags behind him and cameras everywhere. He denied everything. Voice steady, jaw clenched. But by then reporters had already dug up the shell company paperwork tying him to the payments. Within hours, his own party leaders were on TV demanding he resign and fully cooperate. 3 of his biggest donors bailed the same day. Money dries up fast when the truth starts leaking. That night my phone lit up, Deshaun. He whispered that a black SUV had tailed him from his warehouse shift all the way home. 2 men sat in it across the street for an hour, engine idling, lights off. Only when he called 911 did they pull away like ghosts. The FBI didn't hesitate after that. By morning they had protection on our whole family. Agents shadowing us to work, to the store, even to the hospital. You get used to the suits, kind of. Okay, not really. Then James called me at dawn, voice cracking. He'd been fired from the auto shop out of nowhere. His boss wouldn't look him in the eye, just muttered that someone important threatened to shut the business down if James kept working there. Haley filed a wrongful termination suit before lunch, and FBI added witness intimidation to their case. Every scare tactic they threw at us just made us dig our heels in deeper. 2 weeks crawled by, and then, finally, a sliver of light. At the hospital, during Caleb's therapy, a nurse tugged me aside and showed me his progress chart. The line was trending up for the first time. She pointed to the monitor tracking his throat movement. I watched my boy really try to push sound through damaged pathways. The noises came out rough, broken. But they were there. I sat with him for 3 hours, squeezing his hand every time a new sound made it into the air. Not words yet, but hope, loud and clear. That afternoon, Bryant's wife walked into Haley's office carrying a cardboard box like it weighed 100 pounds. She spread the contents across the conference table. Receipts, bank slips, notes she'd squirreled away without knowing why. Cash withdrawals that lined up perfectly with camera equipment purchases. She said she'd overheard Bryant talking about angles and lighting for the counseling room. The divorce papers were already filed. She wanted immunity in exchange for the truth. Haley recorded for 4 hours, every whisper, every late-night call, every pattern from 8 years of a marriage rotting from the inside. She also revealed Bryant's side hustle, selling copies of the videos to private collectors he met online. My stomach turned, but the paper trail was undeniable. 3 days later, at 2 in the morning, my phone rang again. Agent Wyatt. His voice was tight with adrenaline. The FBI had just hit multiple sites, facilities in Georgia and Alabama, after emails from the warden led them down the chain. Turned out the same private company that ran our detention center operated 6 more across the southeast. Investigators found the same Tuesday night pattern at 3 of them, boys with the same targeted brain injuries. The network was bigger than anyone wanted to admit. 40-plus staff trading videos, swapping techniques for silencing victims like it was some twisted training manual. And as Wyatt kept talking, I stared at the ceiling, awake and shaking. Because if the network stretched across state lines like that, then somewhere, someone higher up was still pulling strings, and we hadn't cut the head off the snake yet. Within a week of the raids, the dam started to break. Officer Henderson's lawyer reached out first, practically begging the FBI for a deal before the others flipped on him. Henderson showed up with Cole, and the feds separated them into different rooms. For 12 straight hours, both men spilled everything. They described how the warden had recruited them, how he trained them with surgical precision, exactly where to strike boys so the damage would land on the speech center without killing them. They gave up names of buyers. They laid out bank records. They explained how they picked victims. Kids with no strong family, no lawyer, no money. Kids like Caleb. By the end, both Henderson and Cole had signed plea deals. 15 years in exchange for testifying against the rest, including the judge who'd been their biggest customer for 5 years. The next morning, I was at the hospital watching Caleb with a new piece of equipment they'd brought in. A screen covered in letters. The machine tracked his eye movements, teaching him to focus long enough on each letter to build words. At first, it was a mess, just random letters strung together. But after 3 days, he spelled DAD. The computer's robotic voice read it out loud. That, and then, LVYOU. One painstaking letter at a time, taking almost 10 minutes. But when that metallic voice finally said, "Love you," I broke. I was sobbing in the middle of that therapy room, not caring who saw. My boy had found a way to talk to me again. That same week, the governor called a press conference. He announced a top-to-bottom investigation of every juvenile facility in the state, with new federal oversight requirements. And then came the news that made Josephine cry when she called me that night. She'd been appointed to design a victim advocacy program. Mandatory cameras in every room. Independent monitors reviewing footage weekly. For the first time, real protections were being put in place. Ryder, meanwhile, was settling into his foster home. A family trained to care for kids with deep trauma. He was in daily therapy now, slowly starting to open up about what happened. Josephine visited him twice a week and told me he still had nightmares, still froze in fear when left alone with adult men. But the family understood his triggers. They gave him space to heal, and they kept telling him over and over, "You're safe. You'll never go back there again." Meanwhile, our civil lawsuit exploded into the spotlight. 3 major news networks ran specials on the case. Protesters flooded the state capitol demanding justice. Suddenly, the court fast-tracked our case. At the settlement conference, the state tried to throw out a number, 50 million. 50 million, split between all 17 victims. Haley laughed right in their faces. She stood up, told them 17 destroyed lives weren't worth pocket change, and walked out. Later, she told us flat out, "We'll see them in court, and when we win, it'll be 10 times that pathetic offer." And the country was watching now. Donations poured in from strangers coast to coast, helping cover the boys' medical bills while we waited for the real justice that was finally within reach. A month later, I found myself in Washington, D.C., sitting in a wood-paneled hearing room with cameras flashing and senators staring me down. I told them everything about Caleb, about the other boys, about how local police had circled the wagons to protect predators instead of victims. They showed charts of the injury patterns, rolled footage of the so-called facilities, and asked me to explain how children could be brutalized in government custody while every complaint was buried. For 6 hours, I relived it all. And when it was over, 3 senators promised they would draft legislation mandating federal oversight of every juvenile facility in the country, with suspicious injuries reported directly to the FBI, not local cops who might be on the payroll. The committee chairman closed with an apology to every family. "We failed to protect your children," he said. My hands shook under the table. Words couldn't undo what had already been done, but maybe, finally, they were going to change something. 2 months after his arrest, Bryant stood before a federal judge for sentencing. Even with his so-called cooperation, the judge's words cut like steel. "Your crimes against children are unforgivable. 25 years. And they didn't even dare put him in general population. Word of what he'd done had spread, and inmates were already promising to make him pay the moment he stepped through those gates. 3 weeks later, it was Sparks' turn. The warden. I sat in that courtroom every single day, refusing to look away while prosecutors played the very videos he'd sold for profit. Jurors couldn't even hold their gaze. One woman broke down and ran out sobbing when the screen showed the worst of it. His lawyer tried spinning a story that Bryant had forced him into it, but the evidence shredded that lie. Offshore accounts stacked with millions, payments dating back 8 years before Bryant ever wore a uniform. Then came the witnesses, 23 boys, testifying through written statements because most of them still couldn't speak. Every story carried the same chilling pattern. Tuesday nights, the counseling room, silence forced on them. When prosecutors unveiled the medical scans, brain tissue clearly targeted, the courtroom itself seemed to crack. Even the presiding judge had to recess, leaving the bench with tears in his eyes. The verdict came back fast. Guilty on all 117 counts, from conspiracy to child abuse material to operating a criminal enterprise. The sentencing was thunderous. Life without parole, plus 300 years, served consecutively. As bailiffs dragged him from the courtroom, Sparks screamed about appeals, while families in the gallery stood clapping through tears. And then came the judge's trial. The one who'd been buying children's pain for more than a decade. Victims poured out of the woodwork, not just from the detention center, but from his own neighborhood. 3 boys from down the block. 2 from the youth basketball team he'd coached. Financial records painted the picture. Steady payments to Sparks stretching back 12 years. And then the FBI's discovery. A false wall in his basement hiding hard drives. Thousands of videos cataloged and stashed away like trophies. In a final, desperate move, he tried to cut a deal, offering to name other buyers. But prosecutors shut him down. "We already have everyone," they said. The jury deliberated barely 2 hours before handing down the verdict. Guilty. 40 years federal time with no parole for 30. Forced sex offender registration. And the civil suits? They stripped him bare. His house, his assets, every dollar he had left. Seized by the families of the boys he'd destroyed. For once, the monsters were the ones losing everything. 2 weeks later, it was Senator Davies' turn to face justice. For years, he'd walked the halls of power like he was untouchable. But this time, not even his connections could shield him. The FBI laid it all bare. Records proving he funneled campaign funds through shell companies to buy videos. $3 million worth over 5 years. Worse, prosecutors revealed he had personally requested certain boys, chosen from intake photos at the detention centers. On the first day of trial, his wife sat in the gallery, face pale, eyes hollow. By the second day, she was gone. That week, she filed for divorce. When reporters asked, she broke down, saying she had no idea what her husband had been doing and wished she could have stopped it. She apologized to every family, saying she was sorry her silence had cost so much. The jury didn't hesitate. 30 years. No pension. The $2 million retirement package he thought he'd enjoy in luxury? Redirected into a victim compensation fund. When it was all over, the dominoes started to fall in the best possible way. Haley, the lawyer who'd stood by us from the beginning, became a household name. News anchors called her the hero attorney who took down an entire network of predators. Families from across the country began reaching out, begging for her help. So she built something bigger, a nonprofit law firm dedicated to protecting children in state custody. The state gave her a grant, and within a month, she had 5 more lawyers at her side, ready to fight. Agent Wyatt got his recognition too. In Washington, at a ceremony under the bright lights, the FBI director himself pinned a medal to his chest. Wyatt told reporters afterward that none of this would have been possible without regular people standing up against corruption. He looked right into the cameras and thanked our family for being brave enough to fight back. And then, for months after the night everything came crashing down, Caleb came home. The hospital cleared him, with round-the-clock nursing care covered by the settlement money. His room was transformed into a small medical unit, machines to strengthen his throat muscles, a computer system that gave him a voice, and a quiet strength that only he seemed to carry. He'd started learning sign language, hands shaky at first but growing steadier each day. The speech therapist came 3 times a week, reminding us that every rough sound he forced out was a victory, a sign that his brain was still trying to heal. I sat with him often, watching him spell words with his eyes, or signing slowly with his hands, and I held on to every little milestone like it was gold. Meanwhile, Deshaun turned his pain into purpose. He began visiting youth groups, standing in front of kids who'd never imagine what really goes on behind closed doors. He told them the truth, how predators hide in the very systems meant to protect them, and how to recognize the warning signs. Josephine helped him build a full program, workshops, resources, hotline numbers. Together, they spoke at schools, churches, community centers, reaching hundreds of kids every single month. From the ashes of everything we'd lost, something new was being built. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like the world was finally listening. James struggled for months after getting fired. Every job application ended in silence, every interview cut short once they realized who he was tied to. But then Haley stepped in. She offered him a place at her new law firm, not as a lawyer but as an investigator. She said his street smarts, his instincts were exactly what families needed when they were fighting for their kids. And James didn't just take the job, he thrived. His wrongful termination case wrapped up with a $200,000 settlement when his old boss couldn't explain why he was fired right after testifying. With that money, James bought his first home and enrolled in night classes to get his private investigator license. From being thrown out of the system, he'd carved himself a new future. Meanwhile, Timothy's aunt kept her promise to the boys who didn't make it out. She reached out to every family, every parent, every sibling touched by the scandal. And together, they started a support group that met every Thursday night at the community center. They shared stories, tears, silence, hope. Timothy's aunt said finally knowing who killed her nephew gave her a kind of peace, enough to sleep through the night for the first time in years. The pain would never vanish. But now it had a name. 6 months after that night in the counseling room, I was sitting with Caleb, running through his speech exercises like we did every day. And then something different happened. His mouth shaped itself differently. The sound came out broken, slurred, but clear enough to shatter me. Asterisk, Dad. Asterisk. For the first time since his injury, my son called me Dad. The therapist started crying right there in the room, telling me this was the breakthrough, the first barrier smashed. More words would follow. I grabbed Caleb's hand, tears streaming, whispering, "I hear you, son. I hear you." 2 weeks later, Ryder showed up at our door. He wasn't the shattered boy we'd carried out of that room. Not anymore. He stood there in a crisp school uniform, eyes bright, holding himself tall. He hugged me tight and told me he was pulling straight A's. Said he wanted to be a lawyer like Haley one day, to fight for kids who couldn't fight for themselves. Then he turned to Caleb. He told him he was brave, brave for surviving, brave for fighting, even without words. Caleb smiled back, his hand twitching in a half-formed sign he'd been practicing. His way of saying thank you. 3 months after the arrests, the state announced the detention center would never open its doors again. Instead, they converted it into a community hub for at-risk youth. At the dedication ceremony, they unveiled a bronze plaque with 5 names engraved, Timothy's, and for other boys who hadn't survived their injuries. Timothy's aunt stood before the crowd, her voice trembling but strong. She said the community had failed those children once, but would never forget them again. And then, our story went national. Headlines across the country. Families flooding Congress with calls, demanding change. 6 months later, we got it. Caleb's Law. Congress passed it unanimously. The president signed it in the Rose Garden with me and Caleb sitting in the front row, cameras flashing, reporters capturing the moment. Caleb's name now carried a law behind it. A promise that no facility could ever run without cameras in every room, without independent inspectors combing through footage every month. The system that had tried to silence my son now had to answer to him. 8 months after it all began, the settlement money finally came through. Enough to guarantee Caleb the best care and therapy for the rest of his life. We packed up our cramped old apartment and moved 40 miles away, into a quiet neighborhood where nobody knew our story. A place where Caleb could heal without strangers staring at him everywhere we went. The new house had a therapy room filled with his equipment, and a yard where he could practice walking without his cane when his legs grew stronger. And while Caleb worked on healing, the ripple effects of our case spread nationwide. Other states launched investigations into their own juvenile facilities. The FBI coordinated raids across 12 states, leading to 43 more arrests and hundreds of victims identified, every one of them carrying the same brain injury patterns. Some centers were shut down. Others had their entire staff replaced. Caleb's right side stayed weak from the damage, but months of occupational therapy taught him to use his left hand. One afternoon, he picked up a pencil, his movements shaky but determined, and slowly wrote out, "Thank you for fighting for me." 6 little words, written in uneven lines, that I still carry folded in my wallet to this day. A year after the night in the counseling room, the prosecutor called. They needed Caleb's testimony for the last trial of a guard. And so Caleb sat in a courtroom, his eye-tracking computer set up in front of him. He typed out his story, letter by letter, as the jury watched on the big screen. No embellishment, no theatrics, just the raw truth appearing word by word. When he finished, the guard's lawyer didn't even attempt cross-examination. The jury returned in under an hour. Guilty. 30 years. The judge said Caleb's testimony was the bravest thing he'd seen in 4 decades on the bench. Life kept moving forward. On the anniversary of the night we saved Ryder, Deshawn dropped to one knee and proposed to Josephine. 6 months later, we packed into her church to watch them marry. Caleb stood proudly as best man, using his device to deliver a speech that had the whole church in tears. Deshawn saved not just me, the computer voice said, but every boy who would have been hurt if we hadn't stopped it. He is a hero, and he deserves every happiness in the world. Josephine wore her grandmother's dress. Deshawn couldn't stop smiling. Even James cracked jokes during his toast about his cousin finally settling down, and for once, laughter came without the shadow of pain. Caleb took his studies online since regular school was too difficult with his disabilities. But he shocked everyone, straight A's, perfect scores, essays on disability rights that teachers shared across districts. He told me through his device that he wanted to become an advocate, to fight for disabled victims who couldn't speak for themselves. He never missed an assignment, no matter how hard therapy wore him out. Meanwhile, Timothy's aunt's support group kept growing. From a handful of grieving parents to over 50 families, all meeting in the old detention center, now a community hub. We sat in circles, swapping stories, cheering on small victories. A child speaking their first word, a nightmare-free night, a family getting through another day. Some drove hours just to sit with people who understood. We brought food. The kids who could play ran in the halls where abuse once reigned. And the walls carried something new, hope. 3 years later, I walked into Caleb's room and saw him with his therapist. His voice came out rough, deeper than it had been before the injury, but clear. "Dad, can you help me practice my graduation speech?" he asked, holding up a sheet of paper. He read line by line, his tongue working hard to shape words that once seemed lost forever. At one point, he stopped, looked right at me and said, I remember everything that happened to me, and I'm proud of you for not giving up when everyone told you to stop fighting. My eyes burned hot, and I had to look away. The therapist smiled, packed up, and promised she'd see us for the last session before graduation. 2 weeks later, I sat in the front row of the community center's main hall. The same building that once destroyed children now held their triumphs. Caleb crossed the stage in his cap and gown, steady on his cane. The principal announced his name with honors, praising his perfect grades. And as he accepted that diploma, I thought back to the night 3 years earlier, breaking into that counseling room and finding Bryant with that boy. We hadn't just survived, we'd burned their whole empire to the ground. We made sure no other child would ever suffer like Caleb did. And now, standing there in his cap and gown, Caleb wasn't just a survivor. He was proof that even when the system tries to silence you, the truth will find a way to speak.
Thanks for watching. Today's train wreck is over, but tomorrow's ride is already on track. Subscribe so you don't miss it.